Azure Data Factory allows you to build data pipelines that manage your data from initial ingestion through transformation to storage in a target database. This data management is typically a recurring process. As data arrives in the system, it's processed through the pipeline. In this video, we're going to discuss Azure Data Factory triggers. Triggers allow you to define when your data pipelines run in Azure Data Factory. So first, let's look at data pipelines and how they run. A trigger fires a pipeline run, which is defined as a single execution of a pipeline. So this means a single batch of values are loaded from a source, transformed in whatever manner the pipeline processes the data, and then the transformed data is stored in a target or sink data source. Each pipeline run has a unique pipeline ID, so you can identify the run among other runs. And there are two ways a pipeline can be triggered in Data Factory. The first way is with an on-demand execution. With a button click in the UI, you can manually force an immediate creation and execution of a new pipeline run. This is done either for one-off pipelines, which are not very common, or for debugging purposes. Normally, you would create a trigger, which we're going to discuss, and a new pipeline run would be created and executed each time the trigger fired according to its logic. Here are the Azure Data Factory trigger types that we're going to look at. Schedule, which allows you to set a calendar type trigger. Tumbling window for more precise time frame triggers. Storage event for triggering based on Blob storage events. And finally, custom event, which allows you to base your trigger on any custom event your services or applications might generate. So first we have the schedule trigger. This type of trigger lets you set a recurring schedule. For example, you can configure it to trigger a pipeline run every Friday at 2 p.m. Or you could configure it to trigger a run every 4 hours. A schedule trigger is a fire and forget type of trigger. This means that it doesn't track the pipeline run success or failure. It simply starts the run and then moves on. A schedule trigger will only trigger pipeline runs for times after it started running. It doesn't run pipelines for past events. So, for example, if you create a schedule trigger that's supposed to trigger a pipeline run every day, it's only going to run from the day you activate the trigger and days moving forward. It will never run for days preceding the activation time. If a schedule trigger is disabled for a week, there's no way to get the trigger to backfill that week when it's reactivated. You can't rely on a schedule trigger triggering at precisely the right time. It's not meant for that sort of accuracy. So, for example, if a schedule trigger is configured to fire at 2 p.m. every day, it will fire around 2 p.m., but it may be 2 p.m. in 10 seconds. Therefore, schedule triggers are not that good for pipelines requiring high accuracy and timing. The schedule trigger has a many-to-many relationship with the pipelines it runs. This means that one schedule trigger can be configured to fire runs for multiple pipelines. It also means that several schedule triggers can be configured to fire runs for the same pipeline. Being fire and forget type triggers, schedule triggers have no retry logic. You can't configure it to rerun based on whether the last run succeeded or failed. Next, we have the tumbling window trigger. Like the schedule trigger, the tumbling window is a recurrent schedule. You can configure it to run, for example, every day starting on a given day. The schedule for a tumbling window trigger defines time windows. Your pipeline runs can accept the start and end times of this time window as inputs. Tumbling window triggers maintain state, in that they know what time windows have already been processed and whether they succeeded or failed. This is in contrast to a schedule trigger, which fires and forgets, thereby not recording time frame histories in any way. Another way the tumbling window trigger differs from a schedule trigger is that it allows backfill of historical time windows. So for example, if a tumbling window trigger is disabled for a week, then re-enabled, it can backfill the week that was missed by triggering for all of the time frames in that week. Unlike the schedule trigger, which can have some error in when it triggers, the tumbling window trigger is 100% reliable and accurate in how it manages its time windows. And the tumbling window trigger can be configured to automatically retry time windows upon failure. Tumbling window triggers are ideal for pipelines that are very time sensitive and need reliability in their runs. Next is a storage event trigger. Instead of running on a recurring schedule, the storage event trigger monitors a storage account container, the idea being that pipeline runs will be triggered based on changes in the container data. The storage event trigger can be configured to fire whenever a blob is created in the container, and also whenever a blob is deleted. This trigger can filter by blob path, so instead of watching all blobs in the storage container, it can watch only a subset in a given path. This trigger is ideal for the situation where you have data coming into the system and landing in a blob storage, and you don't want to simply pull for changes in the blob storage. Instead, this allows your trigger to fire only when blob data either arrives or is removed. And finally, we have the custom event trigger. This is similar to the storage event trigger in that it triggers based on events rather than a schedule. Unlike the storage event trigger, however, this one is not limited to blob events in a storage account. Instead, it listens to an event grid, which can be configured to handle any custom events that your services and applications may generate. It fires based on these custom event types. And like the storage event trigger allows filtering by blob path, the custom event trigger filters events by subject on event grid events. This effectively allows the trigger to only listen to a select subset of events. This trigger is great if your pipeline needs to run based on more sophisticated events than just blobs being created or deleted. For example, an event grid might manage events that indicate another pipeline is completed, and in this way, your pipeline can always run immediately after another pipeline. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to create an Azure Data Factory instance using the Azure portal. I'll demonstrate the functionality of Azure Data Factory by creating a pipeline and copying a JSON blob object. So here in Azure, I'm on my home page, and at the top left, I'm going to click Create a Resource. And in the new window, I'm going to type into the search box Data Factory. And I'll choose Data Factory from the list. And then on the Data Factory page, I'll click Create. So on the Create Data Factory window, the subscription is already chosen for me under Basics. Resource group, I'm going to choose an existing resource group, but you can create a new one if you'd like. You can choose any region that works for you. I'm using Canada Central. And I need a name, so I'm just going to keep it simple and call it Data Factory 2426. I'm going to go to Git Configuration at the top. And under Git Configuration, click Configure Git Later, because we don't need a Git repository. I'll hit Review and Create. And then I'll hit Create. So that's deploying. While that's deploying, I'm also going to create a Blob storage account. So I'll go back home. And at the top left, I'll click Create a Resource. And on the new window, I'm going to type Storage Account. And I'll choose Storage Account from the list. And on the Storage Account window, I'll click the blue button at the top left, Create. And now I'm on the Create Storage Account window. So I'm under Basics. The subscription's already chosen for me. I'm going to choose my resource group again. I need a storage account name, so I'll just call it Storage 2426, just to make it unique. I'm going to put it in the same location that I had my data factory, which is Canada Central. And I'm going to leave the rest of it default. I'll hit Review and Create. And at the bottom left, click Create. So that may take a couple of minutes to complete, so I'll come back when it's finished. Okay, both of my resources have been created. So I'm going to click Home at the top left, and then under my recent resources, I'm going to click my resource group. And on the right-hand side, I should be able to see my resources. So I see my data factory, and I might have to refresh to see my storage. There it is, storage 2426. So I'm going to click on storage 2426, and on the storage account page, I'm going to click containers under overview. And at the top left of the page, there's a new container button. I'll click on that. And I'm going to call this container demo and hit create at the bottom left. Okay, so now my container is created. So I'll click on my demo container. I'm going to click upload at the top left. So I'm going to click the folder beside files under upload blob. And I'm just going to choose a blob that I have created. It's called demo.json. And on the blade on the right, I'm going to click upload. And that has uploaded my JSON. So I can see my demo.json on the left. And if I click it, and then on the right, I click edit, I can see it's very simple. It's just a JSON file that has a message that says this is a demo JSON file. So this is what we're going to copy. Now, if I go back to my storage account and I'm under container, and at the very top left, I click plus container again, I'm going to create a target container. This is where I'm going to copy my demo JSON. So I'll click create. And now I have a demo container with a JSON file, and I have a target container that's empty. So now I'm going to go back to my resource group, and now we're going to go into data factory. So on the right-hand side, where the resources are listed for my resource group, I'm going to click Data Factory 2426. And then on the overview of my data factory, I'm going to click Author and Monitor. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is create a link to my storage account. So I'm in Azure Data Factory, and on the far left on the menu, I'm going to click Manage. And then under Connections, I'm going to click Link Services. And under Link Services, I'm going to click New. Now I'm going to search for Blob, and here's Azure Blob Storage under New Link Service Data Store. So I'll select it and click Continue. So going down in the blade here of the configuration for my link service, I'm going to leave the name as Azure Blob Storage 1. And I'm going to leave everything default, except the Azure subscription. I'm going to leave that as Select All. And storage account name, I'm going to choose my storage account. And then at the bottom left, I'm going to click Create. So this creates a link to my storage account. So you see under Link Services, it says Azure Blob Storage 1. So our next step is to create some data sets that refer to the JSON blob in our storage and the place where we want to copy it. So in the left menu for Data Factory, I'm going to click Author, which looks like a pencil. It's the second button from the top. And I'm going to go to Datasets under Factory Resources. And there's an ellipsis to the right of Datasets. I'll click on that, and I'll choose New Dataset. Now it asks for the new dataset type, and so I'm going to type Blob, and I'll choose Azure Blob Storage, and click Continue at the bottom left. It asks me what type of file it is. It's a JSON, so I'll choose JSON, and click Continue at the bottom left. Now I have set properties. So I'm going to choose my link service, which I just created to my blob storage, Azure Blob Storage 1. And there's a file path I have to create. So on the right of that, I'm going to click the folder. And this is going to be my source. So I'll double click on demo as the root folder. And demo.json I will click, and I will hit OK at the bottom left. And then at the bottom left, I will click OK. Now I have properties on the right. I'm going to give this a name, and this will be source. So that has created my source dataset if you look under factory resources. Now we need to create a destination dataset. Where are we going to copy to? So beside datasets, I click the ellipsis and I click new dataset again. Again, I type blob under new dataset and I choose Azure Blob Storage as a type. Click continue at the bottom left. Select format, I choose JSON once again and click continue at the bottom left. Now on set properties, this time I'll just put the name here. The first box is name and I will call this target. Under link service, I choose the same link service because I'm copying to the same blob storage, just a different container. And for file path, on the right, I click the folder and I choose target as the folder. And that is it, because I'm not choosing a file, I'm choosing a folder as a target. So I'll click OK at the bottom left. And then I'll click OK at the bottom left again. So now I have two data sets under factory resources. On the left, I have source and I have target. Now it's time to create our pipeline that copies the data. So under factory resources, there's a section called pipelines. To the right of that, I'll click the ellipsis and I'll choose new pipeline. Now I have the pipeline screen. The center of it is where I can create my pipeline. On the left is an activities list. And in the activities list, if I open up Move and Transform, there's a block called Copy Data. I will drag that into my pipeline. So this will allow me to copy the JSON file. So in the properties at the bottom, I can configure it. So I'll choose the tab Source, and it asks me for the source dataset. So I select my dataset, which I called Source. Then I have some options, and I'll just close the activities window so I can see it better. So we're actually going to leave the rest of the source settings the way they are. The file path type is file path and dataset, because if you recall, I chose the data file that I wanted to copy in the dataset. Now let's go to the tab Sync, and I'm asked for a sync dataset. The sync is a target, so I'm going to choose my target dataset. So at the top left in Data Factory, I can click Publish All in the main menu, and I'm going to click Publish on the blade on the right, and it tells me that it's publishing. So that's complete. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this pipeline, and we'll see the results. So in the menu of the pipeline, there's an option Add Trigger. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to click Trigger Now. And in the blade called Pipeline Run, on the left, I'm going to click OK. And now it's running my pipeline. Now this may take a few minutes, so I'm going to pause and come back. Okay, so it tells me the pipeline has succeeded. So why don't we go back to Azure, and we'll take a look at what happened with our blob storage. So I'm going to go back to my resource group, and I'm going to click on Storage 2426. And on the overview of storage, I'm going to click on Containers. And remember that my target container was empty, so I'm going to click on Target. And now you see I have a demo.json, and just to verify it's the same file, I'll click on it. And under demo.json on the blade on the right, I'll click Edit. And there's our message. This is a demo.json file. We were able to copy this file using Data Factory. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate the concept of schema drift in Azure Data Factory. Schema drift is the ability for your data flow to automatically handle changes to data schema on the fly. An example of schema drift would be adding a column to an existing dataset. So let me show you how I'm set up here for this demo. In Azure, I have two resources already set up. One is a storage account called Storage 2426, and the other one is a Data Factory v2 instance called Data Factory 2426. Now, in the middle of my screen here under Recent Resources, I'm going to click the first row, which is Storage 2426, and that's going to take me to my storage account. And on the overview, I'm going to click Containers. And under Containers, I have two containers set up. One is called Source and one is called Sync. And we're going to use that as our data sets in Data Factory. If I open up Sync, it's empty because that's where we're going to be putting data. If I open up Source, there is a CSV file called people.csv. So I'm going to click people.csv, and on the right in the details, I'm going to click Edit on the menu. And you can see that the data set is very simple. On the line 1, it's got first name, last name, and age as the columns. And lines 2 through 7 are just the different people. So we have Lenny Kravitz, age 46, Steven Seagal, age 55, etc. Now, if I go back to Home, and I go to my Data Factory 2426, on the overview of Data Factory, I'm going to click Author and Monitor. So here we are in Azure Data Factory, and if I go to the menu on the left and choose Manage, which is the last button on the bottom, and I go to Link Services on the left, I'm in Link Services, and I have a link service called Azure Blob Storage 1. Now that's already connected to the blob storage that I just showed you. So I'm going to go to the menu on the left, and I'm going to choose Author, which is the second button from the top. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create two data sets, one for my source and one for my sync. So on the left under Factory Resources, I'm going to go to the second line, which is Data Sets, and I'm going to click the ellipsis on the right side of that line, and I'll choose New Data Set. Now under New Data Set, I will choose Azure Blob Storage as the type and click Continue at the bottom left. I'm using a CSV or delimited text blob, so I'm going to click delimited text as the select format and click Continue at the bottom left. Now under Set Properties, I'll give this a name of Source. Under Link Service, I will choose Azure Blob Storage 1, which is my link service. For File Path, I'm going to click the folder on the right, and under Browse, I'll double-click Source, and I'll choose people.csv and hit OK on the bottom left. I'm also going to check first row as header since we have our column names as our header. And I'm going to leave it as import schema from connection store. That's important because when you're not doing schema drift, every data set needs to know its schema. It needs a schema attached. So this is going to read the schema from the file. At the bottom left, I'll hit OK. So I have the details of my source data set in the middle of the screen. If I choose the options at the top, I will choose Schema, which is the second option, and you'll see that it has imported my schema, first name, last name, and age. Now I'm going to create my sync data set. So I go back to Factory Resources on the left. I'll click the ellipsis beside Data Sets and choose New Data Set. And again, I'll choose Azure Blob Storage and hit Continue at the bottom. Under Select Format, I'll choose Delimited Text and click Continue at the bottom. And under Set Properties, I will call this Sync. Link Service, I will choose the same link service called Azure Blob Storage. File Path, I will click the folder on the right, and this time I will click Sync and hit OK on the bottom. And under that, I will choose first row as header. I will check that. And I will hit OK at the bottom. Now, in the center where it's showing the details of my sync data set, I'm going to click Schema at the top. And you will notice it shows no schema. That's because we chose a folder instead of a file. So it doesn't know where to read the schema from. So I'm going to click the button on the left at the top of the center of the screen, Import Schema. And I have a bunch of options. I'm going to choose the first one, From Sample File. I have a local file which has the same data in it as my blob. It's called people.csv, so I'll choose it. And on the Open window, I will click Open at the bottom right. So now it has read that schema, and you see it's the same as my source, first name, last name, and age. So now we're ready to create the data flow. So under Factory Resources on the left, I'll go to Data Flows, which is the third line from the top, and I will click the ellipsis to the right of it, and I will choose New Data Flow. It's important to have Data Flow Debug enabled in the top menu of the center of the screen, which is where my data flow is showing. That way we can use the debug to see our data. So the first thing I'm going to do is add our source. So I'll click Add Source in the center of the screen on our data flow. In the properties at the bottom, I'm on Source Settings, which is to the far left. And it's asking me for a data set as the third option. And so I'm going to choose my source. And for this demo, just under Dataset, there's options. I'm going to uncheck Allow Schema Drift so we can see how that works. Now, I'm just going to minimize Factory Resources on the left, and I'm going to go to the far right tab under our data flow called Data Preview, and I'm going to hit Refresh. So here's my data: first name, last name, and age. The next thing we're going to do is add the sync. So I'll click the little plus just to the bottom right of my source on my data flow, and I will go all the way to the bottom of the options, and under Destination, choose Sync. Now in the options at the bottom, I'm under Sync, which is at the far left, and I'm going to choose my data set, which is the fourth option, and I'll choose Sync. And again, under Options, which is the final choice under Sync, I'm going to uncheck Allow Schema Drift. And now I'm going to go to Data Preview and hit Refresh. And here is my data. So far we have 3 columns and we're feeding it through a data flow from source to sync. Now we're going to look at the schema drift portion of this. So let's go back to Azure for a moment. And I'm going to just go to my home, and I'm going to choose my storage 2426 account. And on the overview of my storage account, I'm going to click Containers. And under Container, I will double click on Source. And I'm going to click on the only blob, which is people.csv. And at the right, in the details of people.csv, I will click Edit, which is the fourth option at the top. And what I'm going to do is modify the contents so that we have an extra column. So now there's a first name, last name, age, and a hobby, and everybody has a hobby. So at the top left of people.csv blob, I'm going to click Save. And now I'm going to go back to Data Factory, and in my data flow, I'm going to click Source on the left. And I'm already on the Data Preview tab, which is the far right below the data flow. And I'm going to click Refresh, which is on the far left just above the data. Now, because I don't have Schema Drift enabled, I don't see the new hobby field. I just see the same data. So how do we get the hobby field to show up without having to change the data flow? Well, simply we go to the far left tab, which is Source Settings, and under Options, which is the fourth option on Source Settings, we click Allow Schema Drift. And we'll also click just below that Infer Drifted Column Types. So it will automatically decide what type the column is. Now, if I go back to the far right tab, which is Data Preview, and on that, on the left, I click Refresh. So now I see my hobby field. So with Schema Drift, it automatically pulls in new columns or columns that have changed. Now let's click in our data flow on the sync to the right. And I'm already on Data Preview tab on sync. And let's click the refresh on the left side of Data Preview. Now I see first name, last name, and age, and I do see something called hobby, but there's no data. The reason it's like that is because the sync is set not to allow schema drift. So there will be no data from new columns. So if I go to the far left tab under Properties called Sync. And under Options, which is the 6th option under Sync, I'm going to click Allow Schema Drift. Now I'll go back to the far right tab, Data Preview, and on the left, I'll click Refresh. And now we see the Hobby column now has all of the data. So now our data flow can automatically handle new columns because of schema drift being enabled. So in conclusion, there are scenarios in which you want to allow a schema drift in your data flow, and other scenarios in which you may not. Azure Data Factory allows schema drift by default, but you can easily configure it to only allow a strict schema without drift. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how you create a pipeline in Data Factory and how you can test that pipeline using the debug feature. So I'm in Azure and I have two resources set up. Under my recent resources, I have Storage 2426, which is a storage account, and Data Factory 2426, which is a Data Factory version 2. So the first thing I'm going to show you is how I have my storage set up here. So I'm going to go to Storage 2426 by clicking on it. And on the overview page of Storage 2426, I'm going to click Containers. And under Containers, I have two containers, a source and a sink. And we're going to use that in our Data Factory pipeline. So if I click on Source, you'll see that I have one blob in source. It's called people.csv. And if I click on that, and I get the people.csv details on the right, and if I click Edit, which is the fourth option from the left under people.csv, you can see I have a very simple CSV file here. On line 1, I have my column names, first name, last name, age, and hobby. And lines 2 through 7 are the people. So we have Lenny Kravitz, who's 46 and likes skiing, Steven Seagal, who's 55 and likes karate, etc. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create a pipeline that copies this blob from source to the sink. And importantly, I'm going to show you how you can quickly debug that pipeline. So at the top left, I'm going to click Home. And under my recent resources, I'm going to click Data Factory 2426. And on the overview of Data Factory 2426, I'm going to click Author and Monitor. So here I am in Data Factory. And the first thing I'll show you on the options on the left, I'm going to click the bottommost button, which is Manage. And I'm under Linked Services. And under Linked Services, in the middle of the screen, you see I have a blob storage linked service created. So that points to the blob storage that you've just seen. Now on the left, second from the top, I'm going to click the button Author. And what we're going to do is we need to create two data sets, one for the source and one for the sink. So under Factory Resources on the left, the second line down says Data Sets. I'll click the ellipsis on that on the right, and I'll click New Data Set. Under New Data Set, I'm going to choose Azure Blob Storage and click Continue on the bottom left. And then under Select Format, I'm going to choose Delimited Text and click Continue on the bottom left. Now under Set Properties, I have to give it a name. So I'm going to call this Source. And under Link Service, I choose my link service, Azure Blob Storage. And under File Path, I'll click the folder to the right, and I'll double-click on Source under Browse, and I'll click on people.csv and click OK on the bottom left. Now I'm also going to check first row as header, because our first row is our column header. And then at the bottom left, I'll click OK. So that creates our source. Now under Factory Resources on the left, I'm going to click the ellipsis on Datasets again and click New Dataset. Under New Dataset on the right, I will choose Azure Blob Storage again and click Continue at the bottom left. Then under Select Format, I will choose Delimited Text and click Continue on the bottom left. Now for the set properties again, I have to give it a name. So this is going to be Sync. And under Link Service, I will choose my Azure Blob storage again. Under File Path, I'll click the folder on the right. And under Browse, I'll click on Sync and click OK at the bottom left. And again, I will check first row as header, and then I'll click OK at the bottom left. So now we have two data sets. If you look under Factory Resources on the left, we have a sink and a source. So now we're going to use those to create our pipeline. So the first option under Factory Resources is Pipelines. And I'll click the ellipsis on the right and click New Pipeline. Now in the center of the screen, I have an area to build my pipeline. On the left of that center area is a section called Activities, and I can choose what activities I want to do in my pipeline. We're going to keep this really simple and just do one copy activity. So the very first option under Activities is Move and Transform. If I click the arrow beside that and expand it, there's an option for Copy Data. So I'll drag that Copy Data block onto my pipeline. Now I get options below my pipeline, and I'm on the leftmost tab of my options. It's called General. I'm going to go to the second tab on the tabs called Source, and I get to choose a source data set. So my source data set is called Source, and I'll choose that. And then I'm going to go to the Sync tab, which is the third tab from the left, and I can choose my Sync data set, and I'll choose Sync. So that's my simple one-step pipeline. Now what I want to do is I want to debug it to see if it works. So at the top of the pipeline area, fourth from the left is a button that says Debug. If I click on Debug, it immediately runs my pipeline. And I'm just going to minimize factory resources at the far left and also minimize activities at the left so you can see what's happening. So in the section below the pipeline, it's on the third tab called Output, and I can see the status of my debug. And in fact, it was queued, and now the status says succeeded. It shows me when it started and the duration, which was 5 seconds. Another useful feature that I want to show you is if I scroll all the way to the left, and then I put my cursor between name on the left and type on the right, there are some buttons that give us some features for debugging. The one on the far left is called Input, and if I click on it, it shows me some JSON, which gives me details about the input to the pipeline. You can see my source details. So there's the sink, and you can take a look at what went into your debug run. If I look at the middle button, it's called Output, and I get some details about the output, such as the duration of the copy, the throughput level. Any errors will appear here so that you can debug your run. And the final button on the right looks like a little pair of glasses, and that's the details. And if I click that and I expand that, it gives you a lot of details about the debug run you just did. It tells you how many bytes of data were read, how many bytes of data were written, the number of files, peak connections, throughput, a lot of detail here. The copy duration, and it tells you about the duration of the queuing and the duration of the transfer, and it breaks it down into reading and writing. So you can get a lot of information about your run. So this is very useful debug information. So let's go see what happened in Azure. So if I go back to Azure, I'm going to click Home, and then under Recent Resources, I'm going to click Storage 2426. And on the overview, I'm going to click Containers. And in the containers, I'm going to click Sync. Now this was empty before we started. And now in Sync, there's a people.csv file. So in conclusion, data pipelines can be built in Data Factory to manage your data flows. And you can test those data flows easily by using the Data Factory debug feature. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate triggers in Azure Data Factory. So in Microsoft Azure, I have two resources set up for this demo. One is a storage account under my recent resources called Storage2426, and the other one is a Data Factory v2 called Data Factory 2426. So let me show you what I have set up here. If I open up my storage account, on the overview page of my storage account, I'm going to click Containers. And under Containers, I have set up two containers, a source and a sink. If I open up Sink, you'll see that it's empty. If I back up and I open up Source, you'll see that I have a CSV file called people.csv. And if I click that blob, and on the right, under the details, I'm going to click Edit, which is the fourth option to the left from the top. And you'll see that I have a simple CSV here. Line 1 has the headers, first name, last name, age, and hobby. And lines 2 through 7 have my people. Lenny Kravitz, 46, who likes skiing, Steven Seagal, 55, who likes karate, etc. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at a pipeline that's designed to copy this source blob to the sink. And every time it does that, it copies over what's in the sink. So it basically keeps a blob in the sink container in sync with the blob in the source container. So I'm going to click Home at the top left. And under my recent resources, I'm going to click my Data Factory. And on Data Factory, on the overview page, I'm going to click Author and Monitor. So here I am in Data Factory. So let me show you what I have set up here. If I go to the options on the left, the very bottom button is Manage. I'm going to click on that. And by default, it opens up in Linked Services. And under Linked Services, you will see on the right that I have an Azure Blob Storage 1. That's linked to my blob storage. If I click on it, just to show you, and the Edit Linked Service details on the right-hand side, if I scroll down to storage account name, you'll see it's Storage2426. So that's my storage account. Next, on the far left, I'm going to choose the Author button, which is second from the top. And under Factory Resources on the left, I have two data sets set up. So let's take a look at those. That's the second line under Factory Resources. I'll click on it. And you'll see I have two data sets, a source and a sink. So let's look at the source first. I'll click the source and we get the details on the right. You'll see it's using the linked service I just showed you at the very top of connection details. And just under that, with file path, its file path is source/people.csv. So that's that people.csv file. If I go back to Factory Resources on the left, and under Data Sets, I click Sync. Then on the details on the right, under Connection, it's the same link service because it's the same blob storage. And under that, with file path, it's sync. And it's not pointing to a particular file because it's going to write the same file. So the pipeline will be designed such that the file in source is going to be copied to sync every time the pipeline runs. Now back to Factory Resources on the left. If I open up the very first line, Pipelines, I see I have one pipeline called Pipeline 1. So if I click on that, I get the pipeline layout on the right-hand side, and it's very simple. I have a copy data block. And in case you're wondering where that is, if I look at activities on the left, there is a section called Move and Transform. And if I open that up, there's a copy data block. So I've just dragged one of those blocks onto the pipeline. Now the properties underneath the pipeline, if I go there and I click on the second tab from the left, it's called Source. I see my source data set is source. That's my data set I just showed you. Now, if I go to the third tab from the left called Sync, you'll see my sync data set is sync. So it's very simply set up to copy data from source to sync. Now, what we're going to look at today is triggering this pipeline. So on the main menu above my pipeline, fifth from the left, there's a button called Add Trigger. If I click on that, the options here are Trigger Now or New/Edit. So the first thing I'm going to show you is how you trigger the pipeline once immediately, and that is by clicking Trigger Now. So if I click Trigger Now, and I get a blade on the right that says Pipeline Run, Trigger Pipeline Now using last published configuration. On the bottom left, I'm going to click OK. And now it tells me the pipeline is running at the top right. Now if I go to the far left menu, and the third button from the top is called Monitor. If I click on that, it takes me immediately to Pipeline Runs, and I can see my pipeline run. The top line on my triggered pipeline runs is the one we just ran. It shows the run start, the run end. It took 7 seconds, and it was manually triggered. So that's one way you can run using a pipeline. You can trigger it immediately. Now on the far left, I'm going to go to the second button from the top, Author again. Click on that, and it takes me back to my pipeline. Now, if I go to the Add Trigger button on the main menu of the pipeline, and I click it again, this time I'm going to go to New/Edit. And I get a blade that says Add Triggers. And I have a pull-down menu that says Choose Trigger, so I'll pull that down. I can either search for a trigger, but I don't have any yet, or I can click New. So I'm going to click New. And now I get a new trigger blade, and I'm going to create a trigger. So I'm going to look at the type. I'll mention briefly some of the types of triggers. Both Schedule and Tumbling Window are types of triggers that allow you to set when the trigger runs on a regular basis. Storage Events allows you to trigger this run based on whether blobs are appearing in a storage, whether they're created or deleted or updated. And then Custom Events allows you to create your own events with your own logic. So we're going to go with Schedule. And start date by default is now. It's in UTC, Universal Time. So I'm just going to leave it at that. And below start date and time zone is recurrence. And by default, it says every 15 minutes. I'm going to change this to every 1 minute. And you can specify an end date, but I'm just going to leave the end date open so it'll run forever unless I stop it. So on the bottom left, I'm going to click OK. And new trigger, blade, and on the bottom left, I'll click OK. Now what I need to do is before my trigger runs, I need to publish it. So at the very main menu of Data Factory at the top, third from the left, there's a button that says Publish All. I'll click on that, and I get a Publish All blade, and I'll click Publish at the bottom left of the blade. So that's publishing my changes. So that's complete. So now it should be running my pipeline. Now I'll show you a few things. If I go to the far left and I go to the bottom button, it's called Manage. It's the same place where we went to see the linked services. 2/3 of the way down the left-hand side, there's a section called Author, and there's a subsection called Triggers. So if I click on that, I can see the trigger I just ran. And if I put my cursor on that trigger, just to the right of the trigger name, you see I have a button that allows me to deactivate the trigger. I can also look at the code of the trigger, and I can also delete the trigger. So this is where you control the triggers that you create. Now right now, the status of my trigger is started, which means that it's currently running. So it should be copying that blob from source to sink every minute. So let's go to Azure and see this actually working. So back in Azure, I'm just going to click my home link at the top left. And in my recent resources, I'm going to go to my storage account. And under storage account overview, I'm going to click containers. And in my container list, I'm going to click sync. Now this was empty when we started, but now it has a people.csv. So what we're going to do, if I just back up to my container list, I'm going to click source, and I'm going to click people.csv. And on the right in the details, I'm going to choose edit, fourth from the left on the buttons at the top. And I'm going to change something in here. and then we're going to see it copy to the sink. So on line 6, we have Mandy Patinkin is 63 and likes football. So let's say we change this to Mandy Patinkin is 65 and likes baseball. And then we'll hit save. Now I'm going to back up to my list of containers, and I'm going to click on Sync, and then I'm going to click on people.csv and sync. And on the right, I'm going to click Edit. Now it still says 63 in football, so let me refresh. It's going to take about a minute because that's how often our trigger runs. So if I keep clicking refresh and watch line 6, eventually it's going to change. And there it is. Line 6 just changed to 65 and baseball. So our trigger is running, so every minute it's going to synchronize this blob with the blob in source. So in conclusion, there are different types of triggers that you can set and manage in Azure Data Factory that allow you to run recurring pipeline logic. In this video, I'm going to show you some strategies for optimizing performance in Azure data flows. Now I'm in Azure here, and in the middle of my screen under Recent Resources, I have two resources set up. One is a Data Factory v2 called Data Factory 2426, and the other one is a storage account called Storage 2426. So I'm going to show you how I have this set up. I'm going to click on Storage 2426, and on the overview page of this storage account, I'm going to click Containers. And under Containers, I have three containers set up: a source, a sync 1, and a sync 2. Sync 1 and sync 2 are both empty. And if I open up source container, I have one blob in there called us500.csv. Now if I click that blob, and on the details of that blob on the right hand side, fourth from the left at the top, I choose the tab Edit. And here I can see my data. Now there's about 500 lines of data in this file. So now at the top left of my screen, I'm going to click Home. And in my recent resources, I'm now going to click on Data Factory 2426. And on the overview of this data factory, I'm going to click Author and Monitor. So here I am in Data Factory, and I'm going to show you how I have this set up. If I go to the far left and I choose the bottommost button, Manage, and it takes me to Link Services, and you'll see that I have a link service called Azure Blob Storage 1. This is connected to that blob storage. Now on the far left, if I click on Author, which is the second button from the top, I have several factory resources set up under Factory Resources on the left. I have three data sets. So if I open up Dataset, which is the second row under Factory Resources, I have Source, Sync 1, and Sync 2. Those are tied to the contents of my blob storage. The source is tied to that file, and Sync 1 is tied to the Sync 1 container, and Sync 2 is tied to the Sync 2 container. Now, if I open the third row, which is Data Flows, I have one data flow called Data Flow 1, so I'll click on that. And the first thing I want to note is you should have Data Flow Debug turned on at the top. It's second from the left on the main menu on top of Data Flow. And this data flow that I have takes data from the source, and it goes in two paths. The first path aggregates the data by company name. So if I click on Aggregate by Company Name, and I look at the properties at the bottom, under Aggregate Settings on the left, you'll see that I'm grouping by company name, and if I click on Aggregates, I'm aggregating it as a field called employee_count, and the expression is just count round brackets. So that will just count the number of rows for that particular company name. Then I send that to Sync 1. So that's a total of two columns, the company name and the count. If I look at the other path, it takes the source data and it puts it directly into Sync 2. So this copies the data without changing it. Now the reason I'm doing this is because I wanted to show you two syncs, and we'll discuss that in a little bit. The first topic I want to talk to you about is partitioning inside your data flow. So you can set partitioning on every transformation that occurs in the data flow, so every step. Now, Microsoft suggests that you do not change partitioning for either sources or sinks in most cases, although in some cases you can, but in most cases you shouldn't. So if I click on the source on the left in the data flow, and in the properties at the bottom, I will go to the Optimize tab, which is fourth from the left. And you get partition option. There's three options. You can use current partitioning, that just allows data flow to manage your partitioning. You can use a single partition. Single partition is going to be slow with a lot of data because that means that it will limit itself to only one partition. So if you have a lot of data, you don't necessarily want to choose that. And then you can set your own partitioning. That's the third option. So if I click on that, there are several partition types you can choose from. Going from left to right, you can choose round robin and you can enter the number of partitions and it will assign them in a simple round robin fashion. The second option is hash. So in this case, instead of a simple round robin, it will take a column. So if you see, you can choose number of partitions, so you can control the partitions, and you can choose a column. And it will take values from that column, and it will use it as a hash to determine how to partition. The third one is something called dynamic range, and Spark uses dynamic range as another way to partition other than hash. But generally, you again choose a column and a number of partitions. Fixed range is a way that you can partition by a specific logical condition that you can enter in. So you can partition based on the contents of your data. And again, you can set the number of partitions. And finally, it's partition by key. And what this does is you simply choose a column and it will create one partition for every unique value in that column. So you see in this case, you cannot set the partition numbers because the number of partitions is going to be determined by how many unique values you have in that column. Now, I can't tell you how to use partitioning to optimize your particular data. You need to understand the contents of your data and how it would be ideally partitioned to run in parallel. But you can play around with these and get to know these partition types, and they can be used to improve and optimize the speed of your data flows. So the way data flows work is that every data flow you create uses its own Spark cluster. So if you want to parallelize your logic, one way you can do it is to have multiple data flows. In this case, I just have the one data flow. If you look on the left, it's called data flow 1. But you can create multiple data flows, and those multiple data flows should run in their own Spark cluster. So that may speed things up as well. Now, another way to speed things along is to parallelize your syncs. So by default, your syncs all run in sequence or in series. So sync 1 will write its data, and then sync 2 will write its data. Or it could be the other way around. You're not guaranteed what order they write, but they will go in series. Ideally, you may want to write these in parallel to save time. So you can do that by grouping these syncs, and this is why I've created two syncs. So if I just click anywhere in the empty spot of my data flow, and then I look at the properties on the bottom, there's two tabs, parameters and settings. If I choose settings, I have something called a custom sync ordering. So what I can do here is I can choose a group of syncs that I want to run in parallel. So if I want to run sync 1 and sync 2 in parallel, I can make them both write order 1. Then they are in the same group. They are in the write order 1 group. Now, if I wanted to run them in series, but I wanted to control the order in which they ran, because remember I said that the order is not guaranteed if you don't set this, I could set sync 1 to be 1 and sync 2 to be 2, and that would guarantee that sync 1 would run before sync 2. They would not run in parallel because they're in different groups, but they would run in that order. I'm going to set them to 1 and 1 just to make them a parallel group. Now by default, putting my syncs into one group will not make them parallel. There's one more step that we have to do, so I'm going to show you that now. Another thing I have under factory resources on the left, very first line under factory resources is pipelines. If I open that up, I have a pipeline called Pipeline 1, so I'm going to click on that. Now in the center of the screen, I have my pipeline. It has one simple block called data flow. And the way I created that is I dragged the data flow from factory resources on the left over onto the pipeline once I created it. If I click on that data flow and I look at the details at the bottom and I click on settings, that's the tab second from the left. I have, first of all, logging level, and I should mention that if you have logging level to verbose, it's going to affect your performance of this pipeline. So verbose is good if you're debugging, but if you're running this in a production environment, you're probably going to have the logging level either to basic or none, unless you have some reason to have it to verbose. None is the fastest, basic would be a little slower, and verbose is the slowest. But I'm going to open what's under logging levels, which is sync properties. And there's an option under sync properties to run in parallel. So if you check this for your pipeline, what it'll do is it will run any grouped syncs in parallel. So remember, I grouped them by giving them the same number. They're both 1, so they would run in parallel. So that can speed things up. Now, the very last thing I want to show you is where you can go to take a look at how your data flow is performing. So on the far left, third button from the top, I'm going to click on Monitor. And it takes me immediately to Pipeline Runs. And I've run this pipeline previously, so I'm going to show you an example of the pipeline run. So it's called Pipeline 1. I'm going to click Pipeline 1 on the first row of pipeline runs. And then under Activity Runs, the same line, Data Flow 1, I'm going to click the little glasses that are the third button to the right of the name, Data Flow 1. And this gives me a whole bunch of details about performance of that run. So once you've run this and tested it, you can go here, and if I click on Sync 1, I get a lot of information. First thing at the top right of the screen, there's something called cluster startup time. So it takes a while for the cluster, the Spark cluster, to start up. In this case, it took 3 minutes, 59 seconds and some milliseconds. Another thing I have on the right-hand side is I have a section that tells me everything about my Sync 1 details, specifically stream information. It tells me how many rows it calculated, so it did 500 rows. In this case, it only used one partition because we don't have enough data to use multiple partitions. And then partition chart, we don't have anything in our partition chart, but normally this would be a bar chart that would show you how many rows were in each partition. And at the very bottom is sync processing time. So this is how long it took the sync to run, to write the data. 3 seconds, 954 milliseconds. So you can use these times to compare to see if you're gaining or optimizing performance. If I click on Sync 2, I see the same data for Sync 2. So in conclusion, there are several tools in Azure data flows for optimizing performance. And by using these tools, you should be able to optimize performance based on your particular data flows. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate a very useful operation in an Azure Dataflow Sync, the Sql upsert. The upsert operation allows you to perform inserting and updating of records in a SQL table at the same time. So I'm in Azure here, and I'm going to give you an overview of what we're about to do. We need 3 resources for what we're doing. The first one is a storage account, and I'm on my home page under Recent Resources. I have Storage 2426. You're also going to need a data factory V2 type. Mine's called Data Factory 2426. And you're going to need a SQL database. So my SQL database is called SQL DB-20426. And the SQL server that it runs under is SQL Server 2426. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a data factory data flow to copy data from the storage account into SQL database, and we're going to use upsert so that we can not only insert new records, but also automatically update existing records. So I'll start with the input, which is a storage. So if I open up storage 2426, and on the overview, I'm going to click containers, and you'll see I have two containers, source and sync. I'm not going to be using sync for this demo because our sync is going to be the SQL database. But I'll click on the source, and I have a people.csv blob, and if I click that, to the right, where it has the blob details, on the tabs at the top, I'm going to click the fourth from the left, which is edit, and you'll see this is a very simple CSV. The contents are in the code window on the right, and on line 1 is our columns. We have the column ID, which is going to be our unique identifier, which you need for upsert, first name, last name, age, and hobby. So on line 2, we have an ID of 1, and it's Lenny Kravitz, who's 46 and likes skiing. On line 3, we have an ID of 2, and this is Steven Seagal, who's 55 and likes karate, etc. So this is going to be our input, or our source. Now at the top left, I'm going to click Home, and on my home page, I am going to open our sync, which is going to be SQL Server 2426. And in fact, I'm going to open up the database we're going to write to, which is SQL DB 2426. The first thing you should do if you've set up a SQL database in Azure is make sure you have the firewall settings correct for this. So at the top of the overview, in the menu, fourth from the left, I'm going to click Set Server Firewall. And on Firewall Settings, there is an option for Allow Azure Services and Resources to access this server. Make sure that's checked to Yes. Also, at the very top of Firewall Settings, in the menu, third from the left, is a button that says Add Client IP. Make sure you click that as well so that you have the client IP under the IP rules. And then in the menu at the top on the left, you can click Save. So make sure that's set up correctly. Now at the top left, I'm going to click Home again. And now on my home page, I'm going to click Data Factory 2426 under Recent Resources. So this is my Data Factory instance. And on the overview, I'm going to click Author and Monitor. So now I'm in Data Factory, and we're going to build a data flow. The first step is to connect to our source and our sync. So on the far left, on the bottom button, it's called Manage. I'm going to click that. And now I'm in Linked Services on the right. And at the top left of Linked Services, there's a button that says New. I'm going to click that. And the first thing we're going to create is our source. So under New Linked Service on the right, I'm going to type in the search box Blob, and I get Azure Blob Storage. And I'm going to click that, and then I'll click Continue at the bottom left. Now under New Linked Service Azure Blob Storage on the right, I'm going to give it a name, and this is going to be my source service. And if I scroll down to Account Selection Method, I'm going to choose Storage Account Name, and that's going to be Storage 2426. And then at the bottom left, I'll click Create. So that creates a connection to our blob storage. Now, at the top of Linked Services on the left, I'm going to click New again. And this time, I'm going to type SQL Database under New Linked Service on the right. And I get Azure SQL Database. I'm going to click that and click Continue at the bottom left. Now under New Linked Service, Azure SQL Database, I have to give it a name at the top. So I'm going to call this our Sync service. And if I scroll down to Account Selection Method, under Server Name, I'm going to choose SQL Server 2426. Under Database Name, I'm going to choose SQL DB 2426. And Authentication Type is SQL Authentication. My username is my sysadmin that I set up when I created the database. So mine happens to be bbrooks26. And under password, I will give it my password for my sysadmin. And at the bottom left of the blade, I will click Create. So now I have a source service which is blob storage, and a sync service, which is Sql. Now, something we need to do is we need to set up a table in our Sql database, and I've already done that, but I'm just going to jump back to Azure for a second and show it to you and show you what you need to run. So at the top left, I'm going to click Home, and in my recent resources, I'm going to click Sql DB-20426. Now on the options on the left, just above Power Platform is Query Editor. I'm going to click Query Editor, and I'm going to log in as my sysadmin, which is bbrooks26, and click OK. Now I see the query editor, and on the left where it says Tables, Views, and Stored Procedures in roughly the center of the screen, I'm going to open Tables, and you'll see I have a people table. And if I open that up, I have all of the fields, the same fields that are in my blob: ID, first name, last name, age, and hobby. To create this yourself, you will run the following create table. So I've already done that. So I'm going to go back to Data Factory. Now the next step is to set up our data flow. So on the far left, second button from the top, I'm going to click Author. And then on the left, it says Factory Resources. So we're going to set up some data sets. So second from the top on Factory Resources is Data Sets. Click the ellipsis to the right of that row and click New Data Set. Now on the right, you have a blade that says New Data Set. So first one, I'm going to type Blob and choose Azure Blob Storage. And at the bottom left of the blade, I'll click Continue. Now I'm on the Select Format blade, so I'm going to choose Delimited Text because that is the CSV file that is our source. The bottom left, I'll click Continue. Now under Set Properties, I give it a name, so I'm going to call this Source. For Link Service, I will choose the Source Service. For File Path, I'll click the Folder button at the right. And under Browse, I'm going to double-click on Source and choose people.csv, and at the bottom left, I'll click OK. I'll also check first row as header because our first row is our header names. And then at the bottom left of the blade, I'll click OK. So that's created our source data set. Now we need our sync data set. So back to Factory Resources on the left. Second line from the top, I'll click the ellipsis on Datasets again and click New Dataset. On the New Dataset blade on the right, I'm going to type SQL Database, and I'm going to click Azure SQL Database and click Continue on the left of the blade. For Set Properties, I need to give it a name, so I'm going to call this Sync. And for Link Service, I will choose the Sync service. Now I choose my table, which is dbo.people. And on the bottom left, I'll click OK. So now I have my two data sets on the left under Factory Resources, Sync and Source. So just below Data Sets and Factory Resources, I'm going to go to Data Flows. And on the ellipsis to the right of that, I'm going to click it and go New Data Flow. And now it creates a data flow for us. Now the first thing you want to do is make sure you have Data Flow Debug turned on. So in the center of my screen, I have my data flow. And on the menu above it, second from the left, I have Data Flow Debug. Make sure that's checked. So in my data flow, I'm going to click Add Source. And in the options at the bottom, it's on Source Settings. And for Data Set, which is highlighted red, I'm going to choose Source. Now, in my data flow, to the bottom right on Source, I'm going to click the little plus. And then in the pull down, I'm going to go all the way to the bottom and choose Sync. So in the options at the bottom, I'm on the Sync tab. So I'm going to choose for Dataset, Sync. Then I'm going to go to the tab second from the left called Settings. And I get to choose an update method. I'm going to uncheck Allow Insert, and instead I'm going to check Allow Upsert. Now it tells you right away that you have to add an alter row. Allowing delete, upsert, or update requires an alter row transformation to set row policies. And it has a button called Add Alter Row. So I can click that, and it automatically adds a step in between the source and sync for alter row. It has to be there in order to do the upsert. So I'm going to click on the alter row it's just added. In the options at the bottom, on the left, it says Alter Row Settings. That's the tab we're on. And we want to change alter row conditions. It says upsert if, and it needs a condition when to upsert. So we want to upsert everything. So I'm going to click on the expression, and it takes me to the visual expression builder. And I'm going to enter the method true and then round brackets and hit save and finish at the bottom left. So that means it's always going to upsert. So now what we want to do is debug this to see if it's going to work. So I'm going to highlight the source on our data flow, top left, and I'm just going to close the factory resources on the left to make a little more room. And below in the options, I'm going to choose data preview, which is 6 from the left. And then on the left of data preview, I'm going to click refresh. Okay, so now we see our data. We have ID, first name, last name, and age. The only issue we have here is that ID says that it's a string, ABC. The type is wrong. So what we're going to do is go to the projection tab, which is third from the left. And here we can choose the type. So column name ID type should be integer. Now I'll go back to data preview and hit refresh on the left of data preview. And we see that our ID is now 123. So now in our data flow, I'm going to go back to the sync, click on the sync at the top. And one thing we haven't done yet that we have to do, on the settings tab in the options at the bottom, we've chosen allow upsert. Now we have to choose a key column just below that, which tells it what the ID column is, because it needs an ID column to be able to determine if records are new or if they're existing records that need to be updated. So I'm going to choose the ID key column. Now I'm going to go to the Data Preview tab, and on the left of the Data Preview tab, I'm going to click Refresh. Okay, so now we see what will go to the sync. And interestingly, on the far left, we have some little icons, and there's a little green plus beside each of the records. And what that means is that the upsert is going to insert these because they're new records. So what we're going to do now is we're going to build a pipeline and run this. So I'm going to expand the factory resources panel on the left. And the very first thing in factory resources is pipelines. And I'm going to click the ellipses and click new pipeline. And so now on the right-hand side, I have a new pipeline area. And on the left under factory resources, I'm going to drag my data flow onto the pipeline. Now I'm going to publish all of my changes. So at the very top of Data Factory in the main menu, third from the left, I'm going to click Publish All. And then on the Publish All blade, I'm going to click Publish at the bottom left. Okay, so publishing is complete. So now I'm going to go to Add Trigger, which is in the main menu of the pipeline, and it's fourth from the left. I'm going to click it and click Trigger Now. Now I get a blade that's called Pipeline Run, and at the bottom left of that, I'll click OK. So it's going to take a few minutes to run this, so I'm just going to pause and come back when it's done. All right, so that's complete. So why don't we go and take a look in our SQL database to see what's happened. So I'm going to go back to Azure, and I'm still in my query editor in SQL database. So I'm going to do a select star from the people table. Click Run at the top left. And at the bottom, you see the results. And we have our 6 records, 1 through 6, so it's inserted all of them. So now we've done strictly inserts. So let's mix it up and do some inserts and some updates. So what we'll do is we'll go back and change the original blob, which is our source, and then run our pipeline again. So at the top left, I'm going to click Home. And then I'm going to go to my storage 2426 under Recent Resources on Home. On the overview, I'm going to click Containers. I'm going to double click on Source. I'm going to double click on people.csv. And on the right, in the blob details, I'm going to click the fourth tab from the left, Edit. And now I'm going to put some different data in here. So I'm going to highlight what's here and paste the 4 lines. We have our same columns on line 1, ID, first name, last name, age, hobby. On line 2, we have an existing record because it's ID 1. That's the first record. And we're changing it slightly. Lenny Kravitz now likes paintball, and I believe I'm also changing the age. And on line 3, we're changing another existing record, ID 6, and we're changing Randall Flagg's hobby to go-karting. Then on line 4, we have a brand new record because there is no record 7 yet. And this is Roger Ebert, who's 74 and likes snowboarding. So we have 2 inserts and an update. So at the top left of the blob details, I'll click Save. So now I'm going to go back to Data Factory, and let's run the trigger one more time. So I'm on my pipeline, and the main menu of the pipeline, fourth from the left, I'm going to click Add Trigger and click Trigger Now. And then on the pipeline run blade, I'll click OK at the bottom left. So once again, I'll pause until that's complete. Okay, so that's complete. So now I'm going to go back to Azure, and let's take a look at what our pipeline did. So at the top left, I'm going to click Home. Under my recent resources, I'm going to go to Sql DB-20426, my SQL database. In the options on the left, I'm going to click Query Editor. And once again, I will just log back in again as my sysadmin. Click OK. So now on the right, I have a Query Editor box. So I'm going to once again select star from people. I'll click Run at the top left of the query. So now I'm just going to minimize the very left window so we can see the results. So first of all, we now have 7 results, not 6. So we now have Roger Ebert in there, who's snowboarding. You'll also note that the existing records have been updated. Randall Flagg, ID 6, is now a go-karting fanatic. And Lenny Kravitz now likes paintball. So in conclusion, the SQL upsert operation allows you to insert new records and update existing records at the same time. And this is a very common scenario in real data flows. In this video, I'm going to show you how to configure an Azure Stream Analytics job to use resource logs, which can help you troubleshoot issues. Imagine that your Stream Analytics job suddenly stops and you don't know why. Resource logs can give you a place to start. So I'm going to start by creating my Stream Analytics job. So I'm on my home page in Azure. I'm going to click Create a Resource at the top left. And on the New page, I'm going to enter in the search box Stream Analytics. And I'm going to choose Stream Analytics Job. And on the Stream Analytics Job screen, I'll click Create. I need to give it a job name. So this is just going to be Stream Analytics 2526. And on Resource Group, I'll choose my resource group. And then at the bottom, I'll click Create. So that's creating. I'm just going to pause and I'll come back when it's done. Okay, so that's succeeded. So I'll click Go to Resource. And now I'm in my Stream Analytics job instance. So the first place I'm going to take you to is logs called activity logs. So on the options on the left, second from the top, it says activity log. I'm just going to click on that. And you can see that we are in an activity log on the right-hand side. And there are a whole bunch of filters you can use by subscription, event severity, so whether it's critical, error, warning, or informational, time span, so it's showing us the last 6 hours, etc. And you can see we have one log in our activity log, which is completed, and it says a few seconds ago. Now what this is adding this job that we just created. So activity logs can show you a lot of different information about what's happening with your Stream Analytics instance. Another place we can turn on logs, if I go to the options on the left and I scroll all the way down to monitoring, I can go to Diagnostic Settings, which is the fourth down in monitoring. I'll click on that. And on the right-hand side, in the middle of the screen, it says Add Diagnostic Setting. It's a button. I can click on it. And then I get the Diagnostic Setting window. And on the left are category details. So this is what you can log. You can log executions of your stream analytics, so that's useful. Turn that on. You can log when analytics are authored. So those are activities in changing your stream analytics. And other metrics, so you can turn on all metrics. It's good to turn all of these on if you want to get as much information as you can. And on the right-hand side, destination details. You can send the details of these logs to different places. You have the option to send to Log Analytics Workspace, or you can archive to a storage account, or you can stream to an event hub. Now, what I'd like to do is send to Log Analytics Workspace, but I don't have a Log Analytics Workspace yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create one. That's actually a resource in Azure. So to do that and to leave this open, I'm going to go up to my browser tab. I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to choose duplicate. This way I have two Azure instances. I can do two things at once. So I'm going to leave the Diagnostic Settings open on the other tab. And on the new tab, I'm going to click Home in the top left. And on my home page at the top left, I'm going to click Create a Resource. And on the new window in the search box, I'm going to type Log Analytics. And I want to choose Log Analytics Workspace. And on the Log Analytics Workspace page, I'll click Create. So on the Basics tab on the far left of the Log Analytics Workspace page, I'm going to choose my resource group. And if I scroll down, I have to give it a name under Instance Details. So we'll call this Log Analytics 2526. And it's a good idea to put it in the same region as your Azure Stream Analytics. And I'll click Review and Create at the bottom left. And it says Validation Passed at the top in green. So at the bottom left, I'll click Create. Okay, so that's complete. So now what I'm going to do is in my browser, I'm going to go back to the other tab I have open on the top left. And on my Diagnostic Setting page, I'm on the right-hand side, I have Destination Details. I'm going to check the first one, Send to Log Analytics Workspace. If I pull down the menu for Log Analytics Workspace, I have the one I just created, which was Log Analytics 2526. The other thing I need to do is give this a name. So at the top of the screen, it says Diagnostic Setting Name. I'll just call this Demo Logs. And at the top left, I'll click Save. So now I have some diagnostic settings. And so now what we want to do is run a very simple job and then see the job details appear in our log. So on my Stream Analytics job, I'm going to go to Overview on the left. And what I'm going to do is scroll down to about the middle of the screen. On the right, there is a section called Overview, and it has inputs and outputs. So I'm going to click on Inputs, and I'm going to add a stream input. There's a button at the top left of Inputs, Add Stream Input. I'll click that. And to keep this simple, we could get input from an Event Hub, an IoT Hub, but I'm going to go to Blob Storage. And on the right-hand blade, it's called Blob Storage ADLS Gen 2. I'm going to give it an input alias, which is just going to be input, just to keep it simple. And under Storage Account, I'm going to choose one that I already have set up, Storage 2426. And I have a couple of containers in there. So I'm going to choose a container, and it's called Source. So any data I put in Source, I'm going to just copy to a destination container. And under Authentication mode, I think I'll just choose Connection String. There we go. Then it has my storage account key. And one other step I forgot, if I scroll to the bottom, Event Serialization Format, I have CSV files. So I'll choose that. And at the bottom left, I'll click Save. So at the top right, it says Successful Connection Test. So now I'm going to back up at the top left. I'll click my Stream Analytics 2526 to back up to the overview. And on the overview, now I'll click Outputs on the right. And at the top left of Outputs, I'll click Add. And I'll choose Blob Storage again, Blob Storage / ADLS Gen 2. So I get the same blade on the right-hand side. Output alias is just going to be output. Storage account is storage2426. Authentication mode, like before, is connection string. Event serialization format is CSV. And at the bottom left, I'll click Save. Now, as it's creating that, it's not too important what I have in these two containers. I just have some CSV files in the source, and we'll just have this job copy them to the destination. That's all we're going to do. It's just to create a very simple job so that we can test it. So at the top left, I'm going to click Stream Analytics 2526 to back up again. Now we have to modify our query. So under Overview on the right-hand side, there's a query window that says select star into your output alias from your input alias. So on the top right of that, I'm going to click Edit Query. I'm on a query page, and in the middle of the screen, I have a query screen that I can edit. And so I'm going to add my inputs and outputs. So I'm going to change it to select star into output from input. And at the top, I will click Save Query. So that's saved. So at the top left, I'm going to click my Stream Analytics 2526 again to go back to Overview. And now, at the top left of my overview, I'm going to click Start. And I get a Start Job blade on the right-hand side, and at the bottom left, I'm going to click Start. So that will start my Stream Analytics, and then we should be able to see some logs as a result. Okay, so it started our job. So now, if I go to the options on the left, and I scroll down, all the way down to monitoring, to see the results, we choose the first option under monitoring, which is logs. So now on the right-hand side, we see our logs. I'm just going to close this queries window that pops up. And behind it, we have a tab called New Query 1. And this is a query editor on the right-hand side. There's a query window. And there's a very rich query language that this uses that I can't cover completely here, but I can show you a simple example. So on the left, there are 3 tabs under New Query 1. There's Table, Queries, and Filter. I'm going to click Queries. And you can see that you can query for input data errors, other errors and failures, output data errors. I'm just going to open up input data errors. Now, we're not going to have any errors, but I'm going to choose the first one under input data errors, list all input data errors. If I click it, it automatically fills in the query on the right-hand side in the query window. And if I click Run, it tells me there's no results, which means I don't have any errors. But if there were errors, it would give you details. I'm just going to select all and delete what's in the query window. And if I go back on the left and I click Tables, under the Tables tab, if I go right to the bottom, there's a section called Stream Analytics Jobs. So that will give us details about the jobs we're running, not just errors. So if I double click on Azure Diagnostics right underneath it, it fills in the query for me on the right in the query window, which is just Azure Diagnostics. If I click the Run button just above the query window, now I get some results. Now let's take a quick look at one of the results. So I'm going to minimize on the far left, I'm going to minimize the menu. And I'm also going to minimize the menu underneath New Query 1 on the left, just so we have more room. And then I'll drag the separation between the query at the top and the results at the bottom. So you see the results. Some of them are in the category execution and some of them are authoring. If I open up one called execution, I see a bunch of information, what tenant it's running on. That's my Azure tenant. And resource ID, resource group, all this information. If I scroll down, I get the operation name, which is stop job. So this is when I stopped the job at some point in the past. I've been doing some things in the past here, so these are some past details. And if I scroll down far enough, I get to a property called properties_s. If I open that up, there's a lot more information about the job that ran, such as a job ID, job run status, is that it's stopping. So if you have errors in your jobs, there will be error details in these logs that you can look at here. Now, one word of caution is that it can take several minutes for these logs to propagate. So sometimes you won't see the results of errors immediately, but you will see them within Microsoft says around 3 minutes, give or take. So in conclusion, resource logs help you troubleshoot issues. Azure Monitor Logs also allows you to query your logs to find relevant details. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate incremental data loads, where newest data is inserted from a source into a sink in batches or increments over time. So in Azure, I'm going to show you my source data. So I'm on my home page. So under Recent Resources, I have a storage account called Storage2426. I'm going to click on that. And on the Overview page of Storage2426, I'm going to click Containers. In Containers, I have a source container. I'm going to click on that. And in my source container is one blob called people.csv. So I'll click on that. And on the details of the blob on the right-hand side, I'm going to click the fourth tab from the left at the top, and that's Edit. And you can see in the Edit window on the right the contents of my blob. So on line 1, we have the columns, which are ID, first name, last name, age, and hobby. And then we have 3 records, and their IDs are 1, 2, and 3. So this is going to be our first load. We're going to load this data into a SQL table. And after that, we're going to do a second incremental load with some more data. So at the top left, I'm going to click my home, and I'll show you the Sql Sync. So under Recent Resources, I have a SQL database set up called Sql DB-20426. So I'll click on that. And on the options on the left, I'm going to click Query Editor. And I'm going to log in with my sysadmin and click OK at the bottom of the login screen on the right. So now I'm in Query Editor, and on the left-hand side, if I open up Tables, you can see I have a people table. And if I expand it, it's got the same schema as our blob source. So it has the ID, first name, last name, age, and hobby. If I do a select, I see that it's empty. So that's going to be where we're going to write our data. That's our sink. So I'm going to click Home at the top left again. And now we'll go to my data factory. So under Recent Resources, I have a data factory called Data Factory 2426. I'll click on that. And on the overview of the data factory, I'll click Author and Monitor. So here we are in Azure Data Factory. Now I have a data flow set up, so I'm going to step you through it. If I go to the far left and I click the bottommost button called Manage, I have 2 linked services set up. You'll see on the right-hand side of the screen, I have an Azure Blob storage. And if I click that, I get a blade on the right that's called Edit Linked Service. If I scroll down to Storage Account Name, it's got Storage2426. That's my storage account. So I'll click Cancel. And then back under Linked Services, I'll click Azure SQL Database 1. And on the blade to the right called Edit Linked Service, if I scroll down, you'll see it has my database name, SQL DB-20426. So I'll click Cancel again. So those 2 linked services are my source and my sink, Blob source and Sql Sync connected. So on the far left, I'm going to click the second button from the top, which is Author. And under Factory Resources on the left, I'll step you through what I have set up. So first we'll look at the datasets, which is second from the top under Factory Resources. I have an extra one here we'll ignore, but I have Azure SQL Table 1, that's our sink. And if I click on it, you'll see that it's connected to our linked service called Azure SQL Database 1. And if I click on Source under Datasets, you'll see that's connected to our linked service Azure Blob Storage 1. And under File Path, it is connected to people.csv. So it's reading our CSV file. So now under Factory Resources on the left, I'm going to go to the third option down, which is Data Flows, and open that up. And I have one data flow called Data Flow 1. I'll click on that. Now I have my data flow debug turned on at the top. That's important so that we can debug this data flow. So let me step you through the data flow. First, we'll start with the source at the top left of the data flow, which is in the window in the middle of the screen. If I click on Blob Source, I get options at the bottom, and we're on the tab Source Settings. And you'll see under Dataset, it's set to my source dataset. And if I click on the tab Projection, which is third from the left, one thing I had to do is I had to change the type of the first column name in this table to integer, because with the CSV, it assumes everything to be a string. So the column name ID came in as a string, and I changed it to integer. The next step is going to check to see whether the records that are coming in are new. In other words, they do not exist in the sink. That's important because when you're doing an incremental load, you only want to load the records that do not yet exist. So how I do that is if you take a look at on the left-hand side of my data flow, the second source below the first one is called Sync as Source. And if I click on that and I look at the details at the bottom on the tab Source Settings to the far left, the data set is my Azure SQL table. So I'm reading the sync to see if the ID that's coming in already exists in the ID in the sync. So going back up to my data flow, if I click on Does Not Exist in Sync, let's step through that. So in the options at the bottom, the tab is called Exist Settings on the far left. And I have as my left stream the blob source. My right stream is the sync data that's coming in. So I'm comparing my source data to my sync data. And the exist type I choose as doesn't exist. I only want records from the source that do not exist yet. I have an exists condition where if the blob source's ID is equal to the sync's ID, then they exist. In other words, that's how it's matching up records. If the IDs match, then the record does exist, and it'll use that logic. So let's take a look at the Data Preview tab on Does Not Exist in Sync, which is the fourth tab to the left. And I'll click Refresh at the top left of Data Preview. Okay, so what it's going to do is it's going to insert all three records because it recognizes them as not yet existing. So let's give this a run and see what it does with our SQL table. So if I go back to Factory Resources on the left, and I open up the first row, which is Pipelines, I have a pipeline called Pipeline 1, and I'll click on that. And it has one block called Data Flow. And the way I created that block is I just dragged my data flow from the left under Factory Resources onto the pipeline. So what I'm going to do is run this once. So at the top of Pipelines on the main menu, fourth button from the left is called Add Trigger. I'm going to click that, and I'm going to click Trigger Now. I get a blade called Pipeline Run on the right. I'm going to click OK at the bottom left of it. So now it's running my pipeline. I'm just going to pause and let that finish. It'll take a few minutes. Okay, so that's done running. So now let's take a look in our SQL database and see what was written. So I'm going to go back to Azure, and on the top left, I'm going to click Home. And in my recent resources, I'm going to click my SQL database. In the left options, I'm going to click Query Editor, and then I'm going to log in. Now in the Query Editor on the right, I'm going to type select star from people and click Run at the top left of the Query Editor. And at the bottom, results, you can see that I have 3 records. So it's loaded what I had in my blob storage. So now we're going to do the incremental part, which is we're going to put more information in the blob, and we're going to run our data flow to incrementally load more data. So at the top left of my Azure screen, I'm going to click Home. And under Recent Resources, I'm going to click my storage account. On the overview, I'm going to click Containers. And under Containers, I'm going to click Source. And then under Source, I'm going to click my blob, people.csv. In the blob details on the right, I'm going to click the fourth tab from the left, Edit. And now I'm going to include 3 more records. So you see I've added 3 more records to my people.csv, and at the top left of the blob details, I'm going to click Save. So now what our data flow has to do is ignore the first 3 rows because they already exist in our SQL table, and it should copy the next 3 rows to our SQL table. So let's go back to Data Factory. So back here in Data Factory, what we're going to do is we're going to run our trigger again. So on the main menu of the pipeline, 4th button from the left, I'm going to click Trigger, Add Trigger, and click Trigger Now. And then on the blade that comes out from the right, Pipeline Run, I'm going to click OK at the bottom left. And once again, I'll pause and wait for that to finish running. Okay, so that's complete. So let's go back to SQL and see what we have. So I'm going to go back to Azure. And on the top left, I'm going to click Home. And under Recent Resources on my home screen, I will go to my SQL database. And on the options on the left, I'll choose Query Editor. And on the right, I'll log in. And now in the Query Editor window on the right, I'm going to, once again, type select star from people. And I'll click Run at the top left of the Query Editor. So now, when I look at the results at the bottom of the Query Editor, I now have exactly 6 records. So it's now loaded the last 3 records. So in conclusion, it's common to perform incremental data loads with Azure Data Factory as data arrives at the source. Azure data flows make this easy to do. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to use an Azure data flow to manage slowly changing dimensions, which are fields in your data that do not change on a regular basis. So I'm starting off here in Azure, and the first thing I'm going to show you is our source that we're going to read data from. So on my home page, under Recent Resources, I have a storage account called Storage2426. I'm going to open that up. And on the overview of my storage account, I'm going to click Containers. And in Containers, I have one container called Source. So I'll click on that. And I have a single blob called people.csv. So I'll click on that. And to the right, I have the details of my blob. And I'm going to click the 4th tab from the left called Edit. And I get an edit window on the right-hand side. In this window is the contents of my blob. So on line 1, I have my column headers, which are ID, first name, last name, age, and hobby. Lines 2 and 3 are my 2 rows. We're going to keep it simple and only have 2 rows to begin with, just to show the effect of what we're doing. So on line 2, I have Lenny Kravitz, who's 46 and likes skiing. And on line 3, I have Steven Seagal, who's 55 and likes karate. So that is going to be our source data. Now on the top left, I'm going to click Home. And in Recent Resources, I also have a SQL database set up called Sql DB-20426. So I'm going to click on that. And on the options on the left, I'm going to click Query Editor. And on the right, I get a login page. I'm going to log in. And now I have a query editor on the right-hand side. So I'm going to show you the table I already have set up. In the middle of the screen, there's a tables list. And if I open it up, I see people_dimensions. And if I open up the fields, this has more fields than our source does. This is going to be our destination or our sink. This is where we're going to write data. And you'll notice some of these records are the same. We have ID, first name, last name, age, and hobby. Those are the same fields as in our blob. The first 3 fields are unique to this table so that it can manage slowly changing dimensions. The first one is a key. In slowly changing dimensions, what we're going to do is we're going to store the history of changes. So a single record will represent a record from the previous source at a point in time. That means that the ID we're using as a key in the original source cannot be our ID in this table because it will be duplicated. So instead we have this key, which is the primary key. Active is a Boolean, which tells us whether the current record is the active record or whether it's a historical record. We're going to store active and historical records in the same table. And then there's a created date time. So that can be queried to tell us when each record was created. Using the created field, we can query the past to see what the values were in the past. So I'm going to click Home at the top left. And in my recent resources on Home, now I'm going to go to my Data Factory v2 instance called Data Factory 2426. Click on that. And on the overview, I'm going to click Author and Monitor. So now I'm in Azure Data Factory, and I'm going to step you through what I have set up here. So on the far left, I'm going to click the bottom button, Manage, and it takes me to Link Services. So on the right-hand side, I have two link services. One is to my Azure Blob storage, which I just showed you. That's our source. And the other one is the Azure SQL database I just shown you, which is our destination or our sink. So now on the far left, I'm going to click the second button from the top called Author, and I see the factory resources on the left. The first thing I'll look at is data sets, which is second from the top. And in data sets, we have a sink and a source. So I'm going to click source first. And on the right, we get the details, and we're on a tab called connection. And you see that it's connected to my Azure Blob Storage Link service I just showed you. And the file path is my source container and the people.csv blob that's in that source container. So it's reading from the people.csv blob. Now back to datasets on the left under factory resources, I'm going to click on sync. And on the right under connection, I'm pointing to the link service for SQL database. And the table is our people_dimensions table I just showed you. So that's our sync where we're going to write data. So on the left under factory resources, the next thing I'm going to open up is data flows, which is the third option from the top. And I have one data flow called data flow 1. I'm going to click on that. It's worth noting I have data flow debug turned on the main menu. So in my data flow on the right, I have our logic, and I'm going to step you through it one path at a time. So we'll start at the top left. I have a blob source, and if I click on that and I look at the options at the bottom, I'm on a tab on the left called Source Settings, and you see it points to my source. So this just reads in the data from that source blob. The next block is called Add Key Root. Now what we need to do is remember that the source blob did not have a key field. So we have to build the key field when we create new records. So this path that we're on right now is going to insert new records into the table. So what this step does, if we look at the options at the bottom, I'm on a tab called Surrogate Key Settings. It takes the blob source data. It adds a column called key_root. That will be a new column. And it will generate numeric increasing values, starting at value 1. So down the rows, it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So if I go to Data Preview tab on the far right, and I click Refresh on Data Preview, so I see my blob data, my source data, and you'll see if I scroll to the far right, I have a new field called key_root, which just goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It just numbers the fields. We're going to use that to create our key. The next step is add max key. So what we're doing here is we're getting the maximum key value that already exists in the sync table in SQL, and we're going to add the key root to it in order to make a unique key value. So for instance, if there were already 5 records in our SQL table, and there are none right now, but if there were 5, they may have keys of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, we cannot use the key root as our key because it also starts at 1. So there's already 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the database. So what we do is we find the largest key that already exists, which would be 5, and then we add this key root to it. So therefore, our new key would be 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, etc. This guarantees a unique key for every record. So if I just pull down the options here a little bit, you'll notice that my add max key step at the top, which I'm going to click on now, it gets our current columns with the key root, and it also gets something called max key as a new field. And that's defined way down at the bottom here of our data flow. We have an input called sync as source. That gets the current sync data. So it reads where we're going to write to. And then there's an aggregate block. And what that aggregate block does, if I click it, you can see the options at the bottom here, and we're on aggregate settings. And there's an option for group by or aggregates. If I click on aggregates, there's an expression here. And what this expression is doing is it's getting the maximum value for key out of the data that it's read from the destination table in SQL. And if that's null, it sets it to 0. Otherwise, it uses that max key. We have to check for null because, like it is right now, the table is empty, so it won't find a maximum key. So the first one would be 0. And it puts that in a column called max underscore key. And that's what's pulled into add max key. So if I click on add max key at the top, and I go to data preview down in the options at the bottom, and I click refresh. So we have our output here at the bottom, and you'll notice we now have 2 new fields on the data, key underscore root, which we added in the previous step, and max key. And because there are no keys in the table, the max key is 0. So we're going to add the key root to the max key, and that's what we're going to generate our key from. And that's the next step. So the step after this add max key is calculate new key, and I'll click on that. And in the options at the bottom, I'm on the tab derived column settings. We're going to create a column called key, and the expression is adding key root and max key together and turning it into an integer. So let's go to data preview, the far tab, and click refresh. So now with the results, if I scroll to the right, you see we now have a key field, and that's what we need. That's going to go into the SQL database. So key 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The next step is to add the active and created fields. So this is adding any new field. So every single row in our source is going to be added as a new record. And we need 2 fields in there. First of all, we will need to set the active to true. And we need to set the creative to the current time. And I'm using current UTC, so universal time. So that's what this does. And then finally, insert new records is the next step, and it inserts all those new records. So if I go to data preview at the bottom for new records and I click refresh, it'll show us what it's going to insert. Okay, so here's the inserted data. We're going to get the key, we're going to get the ID, first name, last name, age, hobby, and all of them are going to be set as active because they're all the latest records because they were just written. And we set their created time to now because this is us creating the records. So that is a path that gives us our created records. Now there's another step. Now that we've created the new records, any records that used to be active that were in this group that's being written should now be set to inactive. And that's what our next path does. So again, just below the first path on the left, starting at blob source, now we're going to get our old records. So if I click on get old records, which is the first step after blob source, it takes the data from the source blob, and it also takes the data that's already in the destination or the sink, and it joins them together. And the condition, if I just click on condition, I get the visual expression builder. And there's 2 conditions that have to be met. The IDs have to match, and the current active status in the sink has to be true. So we're choosing essentially all of the records that have the same ID as the records that are currently being written, and currently in the sink, their active is true. We want to set those to false because we're writing new active records. So I'll just cancel this visual expression builder. So if I click data preview at the bottom and I click refresh, you see that there's no output data, and that's expected. Why is that expected? Because right now, there are no records in our Sync SQL database. We haven't written anything yet, so there are no records to update. So this will update nothing. But if there were records, the next step sets all of the active values of those records to false. So if I click on that, this is a very simple derived column settings at the bottom. And I basically just set the active column to false. Then the next step is alter all rows. This is a step you have to have when you're doing an update sync. And it basically gives a condition for which records to act upon. So at the bottom here in the options under alter row settings, there's an alter row conditions, and I update if true. I just say true because that means that I update all the records. The next step updates to sync. So if I go to settings, you'll see that I have allow update on the update method. So it's only going to update, it does not insert any records. So once again, I'm just going to scroll down the options a little so you can see everything. The top path inserts all the new records. The second path updates the active field for all of the records that are being superseded by the new records and sets them to false. And this third path is a custom path for getting the maximum key value from the Sync SQL table so that we can generate key values. So on the left under Factory Resources, I'm going to go to Pipelines. It's the first option. And I have a pipeline called Pipeline 1. So I'm going to click on that. And on the right, you'll see the pipeline area. And I have one block called Data Flow. Now I created that by simply dragging my data flow from Factory Resources on the left into the pipeline area. Now what I can do is on the main menu of the pipeline area, fourth button from the left is Add Trigger. I'll click on that and I'll click Trigger Now. And then on the blade that says Pipeline Run, I'll click OK at the bottom left. This is going to run our data flow, so I'm going to pause and come back when it's done. Okay, so that's complete. So now let's go back and take a look at SQL and see what our data flow has done. So I'm going to go back to Azure. I'm going to click Home at the top left. And in my recent resources, I'm going to go to my SQL database. In the options on the left, I'm going to go to Query Editor. And on the right, I'm going to log into Query Editor using my sysadmin login. And in the Query Editor window on the right, I'm going to select all the data from People Dimensions, and I'll click Run at the top left of the Query Editor. Okay, so I'm just going to minimize some stuff on the left so that we can see it better. The results at the bottom show two records that we had in our source, and you see it's given it key values 1 and 2, so that was generated by our data flow. They're both active. They were created just now. They still have their IDs from the original source, and first name, last name, age, and hobby. So the next step is to show how we can modify these dimensions and what it does to this table. So I'm going to click Home at the top left, and on my home page in Recent Resources, I'm going to go to the storage account, and on the overview, I'll click Containers, and I'll click my source container, and I'll click my people.csv blob. And in the blob details on the right, I'm going to click Edit, fourth tab from the left. And now let's change some of this. So on line 2, I'm going to change Lenny Kravitz. I'm going to change his age from 46 to 48. And instead of skiing, he likes tobogganing. On line 3, Steven Seagal will leave his age at 55, but instead of karate, he likes to picnic. And then I'm going to add a new record. So I'll give this ID 3, and this is Bob Smith. Bob Smith is 34 and likes race cars. Now at the top left of the blob details, I'll click Save. So let's think for a minute about what this is going to do. Lines 2 and 3 are going to be updates. So it should store this new information for lines 2 and 3 plus maintain the previous data. So it needs to maintain history of what the values were before. And line 4 is brand new, so it should be inserted and it has no history. So let's go back to Data Factory, and I'm still on my pipeline. So I'm going to click Add Trigger in the main menu and click Trigger Now again. And then on the blade, I'll click OK at the bottom left, and I'll wait for this to run. Okay, so that's finished. So now let's go back to our SQL table and see what happened. I'm going to go back to Azure. I'm going to click Home at the top left, and under Recent Resources, I'm going to click my SQL database. And in the options on the left, I'm going to click Query Editor. And on the right, I'm going to log in. And in the Query Editor on the right, first thing I'll do is select all of the records from People Dimensions so we can see what happened. Okay, so I will expand that. So now we have 5 records. We have records with with ID 1 and 2, which are Lenny Kravitz and Steven Seagal, our first 2. And these are both not active because those are the old records. We also have 2 new records for Lenny Kravitz and Steven Seagal, again with the ID of 1 and 2, but unique keys of 3 and 4. And these are the newer records with the newer values. And then finally, we have Bob Smith, which is a brand new active record with ID of 3 and a key of 5. So it's maintained the old records and created new ones for the updates. And it's also created a brand new record for a new person. So how would we see in this table only the active records? Well, that would be very simple. So the way we do that is with the following query I'll put in the query window. Select star from People Dimensions where active equals 1. And if I run that, now I get 3 records, all 3, and these are the latest values. You'll see that Lenny Kravitz likes tobogganing and is 48, and Steven Seagal likes to picnic. Now, another thing we can do, because we have the created date, is we can query for what the values were in the past. So if I do something like this in the query window, select top 1 star from People Dimensions where created is less than or equal to the 22nd of March 2021, and ID equals 1, and order by created descending. What this will do is it will get 1 record, the top 1, and it will be the record with the highest created value, or the latest record, that is less than or equal to the date of today. Now, if I click Run on that in the query window, I get nothing. That shouldn't be surprising because this created date I've put into this query is today at midnight. So that's already passed. That was when midnight rolled over for today. If we make it the 23rd of March and we click Run again, now we get Lenny Kravitz, who's ID 1, so we're just getting 1 person, and we get their active record. Now note the created time at the bottom here. It was created March 22nd, 2021, and this is a UTC time, 22:02. So let me put a time in the query window on that created time that we're filtering by. So I'm going to leave the date as, I'm going to change the date to 22nd of March, and I'm going to give it a time just before the time that the latest record was created. So I will say 22:01, a minute before. Now I'll click Run. Now it picks up the previous record. So notice at 22:01, Lenny Kravitz was 46 and liked skiing. If I change that to 22:03 in the query and hit Run again, Lenny Kravitz is now 48 and likes tobogganing. Because between those 2 times is when the record was changed. So in conclusion, Azure Dataflow can be used to manage slowly changing dimensions, such that you can maintain and query a history of the changes. In this video, I'm going to show you how to secure data store credentials and secure data both at rest and in transit in Azure Data Factory. So the first thing I'm going to show you in Azure is what resources you need for this demonstration. So you need a Data Factory v2 instance, and I have Data Factory 2426. I'll also be showing you how to connect to a storage account. So you need a storage account. Mine is called Storage 2426. We'll also be using a key vault. So you'll need a key vault. Mine is called Key Vault 2426. So let's go to Data Factory. I'm going to click Data Factory 2426 on my home page. And on the overview screen, I'm going to click Author and Monitor. So here in Azure Data Factory, I'm going to go to the far left and click the bottommost button called Manage. And it takes me to Linked Services. So we're talking about securing data store credentials. And linked services is where that happens. You have two options for storing data store credentials or how you connect to your data stores. The first is to allow Data Factory to manage it. And we will take a look at that in a little bit. The second way is to manage the credentials yourself via a key vault. So that's what I'm going to start with, is showing you how to use a key vault to manage your data store credentials. So under Linked Services, I'm going to click New on the right. And under the new Linked Service blade on the right, I'm going to type in the search box Key Vault, and I'm going to choose Azure Key Vault. And on the bottom left, I'll click Continue. Now I get a blade called New Linked Service. And under Azure Key Vault Selection Method, I'm going to choose my Azure Key Vault name, which is Key Vault 2426. And I'm told underneath the Azure Key Vault name field that I need to grant access to my Key Vault to Data Factory via its managed identity. So let me show you how you do that. Let's go back to Azure for a moment. And I'm going to click Home at the top left. And on my home page, under Recent Resources, I'm going to click my Key Vault 2426. And on the left menu, below Settings, I can click Access Policies. And on Access Policies on the right, I'm going to click Add Access Policy. Now I'm on the Add Access Policy window. And under Secret Permissions, which is third from the top, I'm going to open that and choose Get Secret Management Operations, the very first option. Next, under Select Principal, which is fifth from the top, I'm going to click None Selected beside it. And then I get a Principal blade on the right, and I'll type in the name of my Data Factory, Data Factory 2426. This gives me the managed identity for my Data Factory. So I'll click on it, and at the bottom left, I'll click Select. So what I'm doing now is I'm adding an access policy to allow my Data Factory to get secrets. So I'll click Add at the bottom left. And on the main access policies page, I'll click Save at the top left. So now Data Factory has access to my Key Vault secrets. Now I need to put the connection string into a secret so that it can access it. So I'm going to click Home at the top left again. And in my recent resources, I'm going to go to my storage account, Storage 2426. And on the left options, under Settings, I'm going to click Access Keys. So now on the right, I see the access keys and the connection strings. There's a blue Show Keys button on the right. I'm going to click it. And under Key 1, Connection String, I'm going to go to that, and I'm going to click the Copy to Clipboard on the far right. So I've copied that connection string. Now I'm going to click Home at the top left again. And now I'm going to go back to my Key Vault under Recent Resources. And on the left options under Settings, I click Secrets. And on the right, I have Secrets Details. At the top left of the right screen, I'm going to click Generate Import. And now I'm on the Create a Secret window. So I need to give the secret a name, and I will call it Storage2426-Key. For value, I'm going to paste the connection string that I got from my storage account. And at the bottom left, I'll click Create. So I've now created a secret in my Key Vault that has the connection string. So I'm going to manage the connection string via the Key Vault. So let's go back to Data Factory. And in Data Factory, I'm still on the new Linked Service blade on the right. And I've chosen my Azure Key Vault. I've now granted permission to the Azure Key Vault to my Data Factory. And so at the bottom right, I should be able to click Test Connection and see if my connection is successful. And it is. so we can talk to the key vault and get that secret. So on the left side of the blade at the bottom, I'll click Create. So I now have a link service connection to my Azure Key Vault. Now we're going to create the connection to storage account and use that Key Vault connection. So under Link Services on the right, I'll click New. In the new link service blade, in the search box, I will type Storage, and I will choose Azure Blob Storage and click Continue on the bottom left. Now we're on the new link service blade again, this time for Blob Storage. So going down just above Account Selection Method, I'm going to choose Azure Key Vault instead of connection string. And now it asks me AKV link service. That's my Azure Key Vault link service. So I'll pull that down and choose my Azure Key Vault link service I just created. It asks for the secret name. Our secret name was storage 2426-key. And you can leave the secret version blank, and it uses the latest version of the secret. So at the bottom right, I'll click Test Connection, and it says Connection Successful. So what that means is it can now connect to my storage account using that connection string from Key Vault. So this is one way that you can manage your own secrets or credentials in Key Vault. Another way is you could just let Data Factory do it. So if I were to go back up just above where it says AKV link service, and I click connection string, and I choose my storage account name, then what happens here is that Data Factory effectively gets that connection string itself and stores it securely internally. So that's another option. The only difference is that with the Key Vault, you can manage it yourself. So that covers securing your data store credentials. The other things we were going to talk about is securing data at rest and in transit. So first, let's talk about securing data at rest. In storage accounts in Azure, data is always encrypted at rest. So you literally don't have to do anything. Now, encrypting data at rest depends on what resource you're using. For instance, SQL database has something called TDE, which I can show you because I happen to have a SQL database. If I go back to Azure and click Home at the top left, in my recent resources, I have a SQL database. And if I open it up, and on the options on the left, I scroll all the way down to Security, there's Transparent Data Encryption, or TDE. If I click on it, one note about it is it's on by default. So Azure is very good at encrypting things by default at rest. In SQL database, you can turn it off, but it's not recommended. So that's encryption at rest. It's pretty well automatic on most, if not all, Azure resources. Securing data in transit really comes down to either using HTTPS protocol or TLS. So what that comes down to, if I go back to our blob storage, I'm going to click Home at the top left, and under Recent Resources, I'll go back to my storage account. And if I go to Access Keys under Settings on the left options, so if I go to the right now, I have the access keys, and I'll click the blue key, Show Keys. And I want to point out, if you look at Key 1, and under Key 1, you look at Connection String, it has the default endpoints protocol is HTTPS. So that guarantees encryption in transit. If it were HTTP, that would not be encrypted. So in conclusion, Azure Data Factory can secure your data store credentials, or you can store them yourselves in a key vault. Additionally, data is secured in transit by Data Factory via the HTTPS protocol. And to ensure data is secure at rest, you need to configure that functionality for your particular data source if it's not already encrypted at rest by default, such as it is with Azure storage accounts. So in this course, we've examined how to describe the features and purpose of the Azure Data Factory and features such as the Integration Runtime Service, link services and datasets, pipelines and activities, and triggers. We did this by exploring Azure Data Factory triggers, creating an Azure Data Factory using Azure Portal, handling schema drift and creating Data Factory pipelines and triggers, Data Factory optimization and upsert data, Azure Stream Analytics troubleshooting, and Azure Data Factory incremental data loads, data flow, and security. In our next course, we'll move on to describe the features of Azure Databricks, clusters, notebooks, and jobs.